Tom?
Okay, thank you very much. I'll start now as people continue to join the call. I'd like to welcome everybody this afternoon on behalf of the Columbia Global Center in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. I'm Tom Trebot, the director of the Global Center, and I'd like to welcome to all of you to our webinar this afternoon on what should be the limits to freedom of expression in democratic societies. I've often talked about restraints on freedom of expression, but haven't really conducted a seminar yet on what limits there should be on it. So that's a kind of an exciting part of today's agenda that I very much look forward to. The seminar on freedom of expression is part of a series that the Columbia Global Center in Rio is putting on with the support and encouragement of our good friends and partners at Samambaia Philanthropias, and especially its chief officer of Samambaia, Guilherme Coelho, who is, as most of you know, a tireless advocate for freedom of expression, very broadly understood. So thank you very, very much, Guilherme, and our colleagues at Samambaia. The theme today departs from, it's intended to be explicitly comparative. It departs from the concept that Brazil and the United States have both, each, long held sacred the right of their citizens to express their opinions freely without fear of reprisals or vilification. At the same time, in both countries, and every single day, freedom of expression has come to embrace the freedom to incite violence, to promote racial animosity, and to shame and vilify one's political opponents through spreading malicious falsehoods. It's all from the introduction to today's webinar. And all of this goes hand in hand with the weaponization of the internet as it's come to be known, which has given noxious free speech, hate speech, a much greater degree of power to influence others. Just yesterday, as we were preparing for today's webinar, in a much noted opinion piece in the New York Times, a Brazilian columnist who writes for the Times, Vanessa Barbada, wrote of her experience in following some of the right-wing groups in Brazil that use the popular app in Brazil known as Telegram. Vanessa writes, the columnist writes, and demonstrates with many examples a rising tide of madness on the internet. So why do good people, where does all the hate come from? Why do good people abandon civility? Why do they feel no constraints? Some of the issues possibly we can develop in this webinar. I'll introduce our three very distinguished speakers in just a moment, just a few, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they're speaking, but just a few housekeeping notes from me. Translation is available, diz interpretação, at the bottom of your tela, of your screen. And each speaker, please feel free, speakers, to choose the language you're most comfortable with. If it's English, then people will know to be listening to you in Portuguese and so on. And as ever, our events at the Rio Global Center are as bilingual as we can make them. The world is divided enough. We're trying to surmount at least some of the linguistic barriers. The second is, please, those of you who are listening, to make use of the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen throughout the event. Don't be shy about adding your comments and putting thoughts down and questions for the speakers that we can turn to toward the end of our time together this afternoon. Well, with enough from me for introduction, I'd like to briefly introduce our speakers. I'll introduce all three of them and then call on them in turn for 8 to 10 minutes of introductory comments. Patricia Campos Melo, welcome. Patricia is a reporter and a columnist for the largest Brazilian newspaper, the Folha de São Paulo. Patricia has been covering, seems incredible, but it's true. She has been covering international relations, economics, human rights for almost 3 decades and has reported from over 50 countries, right, Patricia? My goodness. Her work has been recognized with many awards, most recently, I believe, with the Mariah Moores Cabot Award from the Columbia School of Journalism in 2021. She published a well-known book here in Brazil, A Máquina do Ódio, The Hate Machine, the notes of a reporter about fake news and digital violence, and which is all about disinformation campaigns by populist leaders in Brazil, India, and the United States, and the intimidation of journalists led by Jair Bolsonaro and the erosion in general of the freedom of the press in Brazil. And Patricia has written about it and unwittingly became a story herself with the persecution that she then suffered for having exposed the network of fake news. She continues to write on these issues of fake news and the illegal use of WhatsApp mass messaging to send false information. So we're going to start with Patricia and to give us a little bit the Brazilian context, especially in the build up to the Brazilian elections. Then the next speaker will be Professor Jamal Green. Jamal, welcome. Jamal is Dwight Professor of Law at the Columbia Law School. He's also one of the 4 co-chairs of Facebook's Oversight Board, a body created in 2020 that adjudicates Facebook's content moderation decisions. So we have someone who's in the thick of the battle to deal with the promulgation of fake news. Professor Green, Jamal is a constitutional law expert. He teaches in many areas related to constitutional law, comparative constitutional law, the First Amendment, freedom of expression in the United States. He also has been teaching, I think I'm right in this, Jamal has been teaching this recent academic semester at the Columbia Law School on freedom of expression and social media. Jamal is the author of a very well-regarded book I recommend to all of you. I think it came out last year on how rights went wrong, why our obsession with rights is tearing America apart. So that's very much the heart of what we want to get into this afternoon. And then our third speaker, we've got a great lineup today, is Ronaldo Lemos. Ronaldo, in common with Jamal and Patricia, is also linked, I'm very proud to say, with Columbia University. He is, by background, very well known here in Brazil, a Brazilian academic, a prolific commentator on intellectual property, technology, and culture, a director of the well-known Institute for Technology and Society in Brazil. He is presently a visiting professor of law, technology, and policy at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, where he teaches on many aspects of technology and public policy, with particular reference to developing countries such as China and Brazil. And just 2 quick other facts about Ronaldo. He's also a member of the first cohort of members of the Facebook Oversight Board. So we have the material in this afternoon's webinar to do a little case study of how self-regulation by these big media companies is or is not effective. So he works with Jamal Green to some extent in that Facebook oversight. And finally, Ronaldo was one of the creators, one of the intellectual authors of the Brazil's Net Neutrality Act that they call the Marco Civil, the Internet, which was enacted in 2014, which created a comprehensive set of rights for the internet, including freedom of speech, privacy, and net neutrality. So it's been copied and admired all over the world. I'm wondering what, perhaps in his comments, Ronaldo will tell us how that act is being used or abused in the name of freedom of speech in Brazil. So that's it for a great lineup today, 10 minutes each in response to some of the issues that we've been posing. And Patricia, as I said, we'll start with you. So, boa tarde, seja muito bem-vinda. It's nice to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Tom. This is a huge honor to be here and speaking with such distinguished scholars, and I'm with you. Thank you so much for having me to discuss such an interesting, important, and complex topic. In Brazil, as in many parts of the world, I would say that freedom of expression, the defense of freedom of expression, has been hijacked by the extreme right. As we've all come to understand, now, according to some populist leaders, it now means the freedom to, spread hate speech, spread racist attacks, homophobic attacks, misogynistic attacks. So there is a huge concern when you have this concerted effort to, on the one hand, avoid any kind of regulation of speech in the internet, and on the second hand, to embrace this as if you could understand freedom of expression today in an environment where we have a few huge internet platforms that totally dominate the public square, so to say, digital public square, as if it were the same public square we had a few decades ago. I'm not going to have the audacity to get into these legal issues, having here two distinguished lawyers. But one of the things that people say, people continue to use the same concept of freedom of speech that we had before the internet. And we know now that there's not a level playing field. You can't get the idea that the best ideas or the best speech is actually gonna win over the bad speech, right? And there's not a free market in ideas. I think with the internet, one, you have the private ownership of specifically the public squares, so to say, are not public, they're private. And on the other hand, you have, you can artificially increase the volume of your voice and suffocate other voices. So whenever people are arguing, there's got to be no moderation in the internet, and I'm thinking no moderation means actually less speech, because you're going to end up having a very toxic environment with racist, homophobic, and extreme right-wing attacks that are going to discourage several people, and specifically minorities and women, to participate in these digital public squares. So in the context of the Brazilian election, we have been living this quite in an intense manner lately, because when there's an attempt to defeat any attempt to regulate the internet, there's a fake news legislation that is being discussed in Congress, and there were several other attempts to regulate. And the main reasoning against any kind of regulation is that this would necessarily be censorship, and this would necessarily be an attack against freedom of expression. On the other hand, what we have here in Brazil is we are living the same thing. I mean, very similar to what the US lived in 2020, stop the steal / the big lie. We also have a president who has been spreading disinformation about the electoral process and saying that elections are going to be fraudulent, and using social media to do that. And the fact is, we don't have any kind of regulation to know how the internet platforms are going to deal with that. We don't have any kind of accountability. We've done some work here at Columbia comparing the policy and product changes that the platforms made in 2020 in the US in order to avoid turmoil, or already anticipating what happened, right? And this was not enough, as we saw in January 6th with the Capitol invasion. But still, compared to what the platforms are doing in Brazil, what they committed to do, they had this memorandum of understanding with the electoral authorities. They're doing much less in Brazil as they were doing in the US. And I guess this is a common thing around the world. It's much more difficult to moderate or to have any kind of moderation or transparency in non-English speaking countries. We also don't know how many people are moderating or how much is invested in AI for moderation. And we don't have, because it's not so visible, we don't have such a big concern about, okay, so we need to be transparent. This is what we're going to do if someone uses the internet, social media, to incite people to violence during the elections or to dispute results when they saying they were fraudulent. We basically don't know what's going to happen in October 2nd when we have the first round of the Brazilian elections, if the social media are used for that. This is very concerning. So when we are discussing limits to freedom of expression, limits to freedom of speech. I think these are two topics that are really important. On the one hand, hate speech. To what extent, how can you moderate hate speech? There's like hate speech, which is very clear and identifiable. And then on the other hand, there's also speech that attacks civic integrity. How do you moderate this? How do you classify this? As of now, this is done by the internet platforms without any kind of accountability or transparency. We have some vague criteria that they present of how they're going to do this, but it's really not, there's not a participation of civil society or some sort of transparency and accountability in showing us what they intend to do to prevent chaos from happening. So on the other hand, just to make it, we also have a trend to overreact on the other side and to say that every opinion we don't agree with is necessarily disinformation. So this is the other side of this very complex issue. But what I think that needs to be really addressed is transparency and some accountability in terms of how you're going to moderate and how you're going to deal with hate speech on the one hand and attacks against civic integrity on the other hand in the internet platforms, not only in the US, where this is more visible and where you have most regulation trying to implement, although in the European Union, they're much ahead. But in the global South, more attention paid to the global South and to the potential of the use of the platforms to distort public opinion and to incite violence during elections. I think I'm going to finish now, and then we might discuss a little bit more. Yeah. I'm sure Professor Green is going to speak a bit about the US, and thank you all.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Just a quick final comment, maybe. To what extent is the explosion of hate speech in the US influencing Brazil? I mean, is there kind of a global network of people spreading disinformation, a kind of global conspiracy, one might say, or is that just, it isn't that well structured?
Well, I'm not sure if it's coordinated, if there's like an evil guy in a headquarters just like coordinating and financing everyone, right? Yeah. But there is, and it's very obvious that you have commonalities among the extreme right movement in the US, in Hungary, in Poland, in Brazil, and the way they use the internet to spread disinformation, and the same topics that are used, now it's pedophilia, for instance, that it's now being used as an attack against people. So all these topics they're used, they migrate. And even in Brazil, sometimes we import some attacks that don't make any sense here, right? So I'm sure there is an intellectual influence that goes across borders. And there's a lot of, if you think about disputing election results in the US and the way this is being done now in Brazil, it's not a mere coincidence. But I think you should not, overplay it and think it's a global conspiration and a conspiracy and people are not financing.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Thank you very much for that. And with that, maybe to deal then more directly with the US context, it's a pleasure to welcome Jamal Green. The screen is yours, Jamal. Welcome.
Thank you. Very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me and for allowing me to engage with Patricia and Ronaldo. I don't know that I have that much different to say about the US than Patricia has just said about Brazil, insofar as a number of the kinds of problems that we see with harmful online speech are very similar or replicated. Problems of disinformation, problems of hate speech, problems of in the political context, and in fact affecting the integrity of elections, affecting public health. So in that sense, I think there's a lot of commonality as people in some ways emulate each other, compete for attention and engagement online. I thought I would spend a little bit of time talking more broadly about how to think about trade-offs between freedom of expression and other things that we value, by just emphasizing, and I think this is really continuous with how Patricia started, emphasizing the importance of context when we talk about freedom of expression. We tend to have this very, the way in which people react to interferences with free expression tend to be quite extreme, and for good reason in lots of contexts. But again, it depends on what context we're talking about. If you look at the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, it defines freedom of speech and freedom of expression very broadly. It's the freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, either orally or in writing or in print, in the form of art or through any other media of the person's choice. That's an intentionally broad definition. But when you have a right that is understood as broadly as freedom of expression is, I think, rightly understood, there are lots and lots and lots of opportunities for interference with that freedom. And so I think it's really important, if we want to make progress on understanding what kinds of interference with freedom of expression are acceptable, that we understand all of the different contexts in which freedom of expression can face some interference. So we can think of it both from the perspective of the particular institutional context in which one finds or encounters free expression rights, and also from the nature of that interference. So for example, from the institutional context perspective, we can of course distinguish, and people do distinguish, between state actors and private actors. We might think differently about free expression rights as between those institutions. We can also distinguish between private actors that have extensive market power, right, such as a monopolist, versus private actors that have very little market power, such as a business that's operating under conditions of perfect competition. Even when we talk about monopolists, we might distinguish monopolies that develop through innovation or develop through network effects from monopolies that are natural monopolies because of investments in infrastructure, such as railroads or cable companies or something like that. Natural monopolies are typically more resistant to competitive pressure than other kinds of monopolies. We might also distinguish between free expression restrictions by private actors that are ideological actors, or are nonprofit actors, or are members of the press. The kinds of restrictions that Fox News places on its anchors are different than the restrictions that a nonprofit might place. We might distinguish private actors that are business corporations or purely transactional from these other kinds of more ideological players. So I've already identified a very wide diversity, right, of different institutional actors that might limit free expression in various ways. But there are still even a lot of contextual factors that go beyond that, right? So we might ask, well, what's the nature of the platform or forum that we're talking about? How are its rules announced? How are its rules enforced? Is it a Disney message board, right? Or is it 4chan, right? Is it a presidential debate stage? Or is it someone spouting off on a park bench? Is it a university classroom? Or is it the college green, right? Do the users know in advance what the rules are? Do they know what's permitted and what isn't permitted? If their speech is removed from a platform, do they know why their speech was removed? Do they know how to remedy the problem? Do they have a right of appeal? How effective is that right of appeal? Is there a captive audience, right? So that it's difficult for listeners to avoid the speech if they want to. Have listeners opted into the speech in some way? Or can they opt out? Do they have the option of doing so? Are there children in the audience, right? How many children are in the audience? Is it a space where we have good reason to care about or to be especially attentive to the rights of listeners, to having the content curated in some way, as maybe in the political context sometimes? We might want to know who the speaker is. Is the speaker a government official? Is the speaker an employee of whoever the rule makers are? Is the speaker a journalist? Is the speaker a political prisoner? Is the speaker a commercial business advertising its products? Is the speech subsidized by the platform? Is it amplified by the platform? Does that subsidization or amplification come with some implicit or explicit bargain about how the content of the speech might be constrained? Is the speech illegal? Is it illegal in a local context, but not in the context of some other location, right? Is it offensive in some cultural context, but not others, right? Does that variation lead to some kind of marginalization for vulnerable populations within one particular location or another, right? All of those kinds of questions arise before we even get to the question of harm, right? What kinds of harms is the regulator of expression trying to prevent? Are they trying to prevent a public relations problem or embarrassment? Are they trying to avoid some kind of reputational harm to them or to someone else? Are they trying to avoid hurt feelings? Are they trying to avoid harassment? Are they trying to avoid terrorism? Are they trying to avoid genocide? But those are all very different contexts in which we might understand limitations on free expression. Is the harm remote, right? As we often ask in the law, is it immediate, or is it something that one might have an opportunity to respond to in other ways, right? Are there other measures that one might take other than interfering with the speech? In the platform context, we have to ask questions about virality. Is the speed and the scale at which the speech might be spread so vast that we can't engage in case-by-case adjudication? Is it impossible, or is it very difficult? Or is it just very costly, right? Are there relevant trade-offs that we might think about, right? So that limiting harmful expression might also have the practical effect of limiting very valuable expression, right? This is often a problem in the context of hate speech, where if one tries to limit hate speech and be very sensitive to it, you can end up taking down speech that's trying to combat hate speech, right? Because at a very high scale, at a very high speed, you're going to make a lot of mistakes, right? So how do we think about those kinds of trade-offs? All of those contextual questions arise before we even get to the nature of the interference itself, right? So is someone being detained? Is someone being tortured? Is someone losing money? Are they just being deplatformed so that they don't have the ability to access some important space for public discourse? Well, how long are they being deplatformed? On how many platforms are they being? Is it just one, or is it multiple platforms? Are they being taken down by an internet service provider, taken down by the cloud, taken down by a single platform? Or was it just a single post that's being taken down for violating the rules? Maybe it's not a takedown at all. Maybe it's just a downranking. Maybe the virality of some particular piece of content was reduced, or it appeared in fewer people's timelines, or maybe it had a warning label, or maybe it required one additional click before the content could be viewed, right? Those are all forms of interference, but clicking through, having to click before someone views your content is a very different kind of interference with expression than being tortured because you're speaking. Now, I could go on. I won't go on, thankfully. I assume the point is made, right? Which is that it's not that useful to talk about threats to freedom of expression just in the abstract, right? Free expression is just the most valuable thing in the world, and any interference is terrible. Or to talk about it in the abstract in the other direction by saying, oh, it's private platforms, they can do whatever they want. It's all contextual. And I think too often in these kinds of discussions, people end up talking past each other because they're thinking about very different contexts. They have very different kinds of cases in mind. And it's really important. And if you leave what I have to say with anything, it's that facts matter and context matters. And we can't talk about these things as if they're all one thing.
Thank you very much, Jamal. A lot to think about. It's a complicated issue, to be sure. And maybe when we come back in the Q&A and the discussion, we can talk a little bit, Jamal, without putting you on the spot, a little bit about your work with Facebook and how you've kind of implemented some of those general approaches on controlling content. And possibly too, and I think Patricia mentioned this, there's been a new act introduced by the European Union, the Digital Services Act, and maybe what you think about that, the ability of any kind of legislation to deal with the tremendous complexities of context that you've set up for us. But thank you very much, Jamal. And now we'll turn to you, Ronaldo, having heard two very complimentary but introductory comments, which cover a vast ground. Your own comments, please. Welcome, Ronaldo.
Thank you, Thomas. It's really hard for me to speak after Jamal and Patricia, especially after hearing Jamal's very comprehensive problem setting that I think everyone realized like very clearly now that the subject matter that we're talking about here is extremely complex and nuanced. So I'm very happy that Jamal raised all those questions. So my task here is to pick up on some of the points that Patricia has mentioned, and also emphasize one or two tiny but important aspects of the debate regarding free speech. And before I do that, I just would like to say that I'm very happy to see some names here on the participants and to say hello to some of them, to Aurea, Rebecca, Vitor, Vanessa. So you're very welcome, and we are also looking forward to hearing your questions. But the point is, first thing, if there is a silver lining of the situation we are living right now, is the fact that freedom of speech has become a topic that is being widely debated over society, right? So around 10 years ago in Brazil, I was a member of the Council for Social Communication. It's a body that was created by the Brazilian Constitution to make sure that Brazil would never employ again censorship. So it was a body that was created precisely to protect free speech. And around 10 years ago, people would look into our work at the Council for Social Communication and think that was a very boring work. So they would say, well, you know, what are you guys doing? You know, where do you see a problem? Does this council even need to exist? And it's interesting to look back and actually realize that, you know, those were almost like nostalgic times, because the issue of freedom of speech was something that we might, to some extent, take for granted. The problems that we are debating right now, they might have existed at that time, but they were not as present as they are right now. So one consequence of that is that this debate has become a sort of a household debate in Brazil. You look on social media in Brazil, there's a lot of people debating the limits of freedom of expression, and also trying to push against limitations in regards to freedom of expression. And I think that might be a good thing. So I think it helps to increase knowledge about the topic, and also to increase responsibility as well in regards of what is protected and what might not be protected as free speech. So that's the first point. Second point, and then I pick up on some of the aspects that Patricia raised, is that since 2014, there has been some important studies in Brazil about the use of the so-called computational propaganda. So I believe the pioneering study about this was actually written by Daniel Arnaldo, an American-based researcher who lived in Brazil in 2013 and 2014. And he dedicated his time here as a researcher to basically write this very important paper called exactly Computational Propaganda. And he basically studied Brazil's 2014 election and realized that there was a new force in public speech that had not been detected, at least in past election cycles. And that force was precisely people that were employing money, human resources, design, and computational power in order to occupy, we can say it like that, the spaces that are available for the public debate on social media and elsewhere. So Daniel Arnaldo and actually the Brazilian 2014 election cycle was a little bit like the canary on the coal mine in regards to these practices. And actually, Brazil usually is just like that, like things that we face in the country usually happen before they become like detected in other places and widely used. So in some senses, Brazil has been a sort of a test bed for either interesting and innovative uses of technology, but also for some very disruptive ones in the not so positive sense. And I think the 2014 election cycle was a sort of a warning regarding what could be coming after that. So Daniel Arnaldo's research, I think, was a sort of a pioneering warning in that regard. Then comes the 2016 election cycle in the US, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and I think these have been widely debated. And then comes the 2018 cycle in Brazil, in which the presence of this so-called computational power has been widely used. And actually, Patricia is probably the most important writer about that phenomenon. I think your book, Patricia, is probably the definitive reference for an analysis of how that computational power actually happens. And not only your book, but your news articles, your investigative articles at those times, I think they were very important as well. And the problems that Patricia raised, they're still among us, right? So what are those problems? And I'll talk a little bit about them, and then I can conclude and basically get some questions from the audience and from you as well, Thomas. But the problems are, there is a new form of speech that basically disguises itself as just a regular citizen. So when you look at someone, for instance, at Twitter, you might have the impression that you are just hearing from a fellow citizen that is concerned about the political debate, or basically is upset with some governmental policy, like you would expect on a town square or in a sort of a republic. The problem is that in many cases, those accounts, they are not legitimate. They might be controlled by one single entity or a group of entities or some organizations. And those organizations, they are often very well funded, and they basically control a large number of accounts. And those accounts, they do not disclose to you that they are being controlled by a centralized entity or entities. So in my particular view, the problem here is not only or not at all the speech or what is being said by those accounts, but the problem here is the method in itself, right? So this method, it has a problem, which is the problem of deception. They disguise themselves as a sort of a fellow citizen, but they are not a fellow citizen. Those accounts, they might be controlled by, by the 10,000s, by one single entity, which does not disclose that is happening. So if you want to speak with a lot of people, if you want to speak with millions of people, usually that is extremely expensive. So regardless whether that is TV and you're buying an announcement on primetime show, or if you are willing to do that on the internet, that can be extremely expensive. So this kind of communication, it requires the exercise of power. So usually economic power and people who have the resources, the knowledge, and also the design and the possibilities of employing and using this computational power as well. So that is something that concerns me in the Brazilian debate. And just to finish here, we're all watching the Twitter acquisition by Elon Musk, and I'm extremely interested in seeing how that is going to develop, because one of the things that Elon Musk basically claims he's going to do, like in his own words, is actually to get rid of what he calls the scam bots. And the second thing he claims he's going to do is to authenticate each and every user of Twitter to make sure there is one person and one voice. And in my view, that is actually pretty bold, because Twitter is certainly a network that has a lot of presence of bots, and of course, bots, they generate a lot of clicks and page views and so on. So he's basically, taking the company off the market in order to implement those changes. And maybe he will come up with something different, like a town square in which there are no bots, there are no computational propaganda, in which money or power and computational power do not tilt the speech in favor of those who have those resources, and in which each person has one voice and competes with every other voices in order to see who gets to basically put out the most persuasive arguments. If that moves in that direction, I'm all for the experiment. So I think I am very interested, certainly, to see, and I think other people might be interested to see how that is going to play out or not. So let me stop here. I know it's a lot of things to debate, but like that's just a tiny bit of how complex this issue is, as Jamal's questions demonstrate. So thank you so much, Thomas and Patricia.
I thank you, Ronaldo, Jamal, and Patricia, for those tremendous opening remarks. Yeah, it's much more complicated than I was thinking at the outset, but maybe I'll try and just a quick comment or two on my own before we turn over to the questions, which please remind folks listening in, put your questions there, your comments, whatever, and we'll come to them before we close tonight. But I'm just interested in this question of how internet platforms, social media really should be controlled. What is the role of government in it? I know it sounds basic to you, but it's confusing I think, to the lay person listening in. For example, maybe turn to you, Patricia, first. I mentioned Telegram and the spread of hate speech here in Brazil, threats of violence, calls to assassinate political leaders, really crazy sort of anti-democratic messaging. And the Supreme Court, I believe, in Brazil moved in and, did I get this correct, Patricia, took Telegram off the air and just brought it down for a couple of days. It was rather quickly resolved and it's back operating. But it's an example. Here in the Brazilian Supreme Court, does it have that power, or is it to adjudicate content on social media? Are we going to see much more of a conflict between social media and the Supreme Court, and the ergo between the Supreme Court and the president in the run-up to Brazil's election? But the general comment is, how should government regulate? And then I'll come to each of you and Jamal and Ronaldo in turn. But I wanted to ask you first, Patricia, what you think of that. How should we think about that?
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Ronaldo, for being so generous. Thank you very much. And thank you, Jamal, for your amazing remarks. Well, this is very complex. And again, I am not a lawyer, but I think one of the things we have to keep in mind, of course, the great fear, the great concern is that we're going to have the Ministry of Truth, right? That you're going to empower government to decide what is true and what is false. And we don't want to do that. And yes, there is a risk of that happening. We've seen with fake news legislation in Singapore, in Malaysia, in Vietnam, we do not want to have the government deciding this. However, this has been used for too long as an answer of not having regulation at all, right? So, okay, so we do not want to empower governments to tell or to litigate content, right? But on the other hand, we're using this to say any kind of regulation is going to be censorship. So it comes to Brazil. In Brazil, yes, the Supreme Court took the decision, and when, again, maybe Ronaldo can speak more about this. I'm not sure to what extent the court is overstepping its mandate or something. But the reason that happens is because there's a vacuum of regulation in Brazil. So you have Telegram, which is a messaging app that is downloaded in approximately 50 to 60% of Brazilian smartphones, according to estimates, not their estimates, because they don't, communicate anything. And in there, you have groups and channels with millions of people or thousands of people, and you have people selling kidneys, selling cocaine, porn content, political misinformation, and you don't even have anyone in the country to respond to any kind. They were ignoring subpoenas. They were ignoring, any kind of communication. When Germany managed to sort of rein in Telegram, after putting pressure on them, Telegram finally banned a few groups that were, I think they were COVID deniers or Holocaust deniers, but they were extreme right-wing groups. They banned those groups after being pressured by the German government. The Supreme Court in Brazil took this and sort of did the same thing. You might argue, do you think that's the attribution, that's the mandate of the Supreme Court? I am not a lawyer. It seems to me that's extreme, but I do understand that there's no legislation. And the alternative, having a messaging app in a country with millions of users that has no accountability whatsoever. You don't even have someone to speak, like someone in the country or a representative or anyone. It's also not, an alternative. It's not viable. So in that sense, that's what I fear, because we don't have any legislation, right? Because I don't think we're going to have the fake news legislation. And I'm not defending the legislation. I know it has several very concerning aspects. But what we have now is the only entity in Brazil that's going to be regulating or saying anything about disinformation and about, limits to freedom of speech, or even, one of the examples Jamal gave, if I am being censored by a platform, how can I appeal? How can I, get some kind of justification? The only entity is the Supreme Court, because there's no legislation. There's no, and this is absolutely horrible. We're entering into the electoral campaign with no rules. Okay, there's self-regulation, but we know it's not enough. Right, and then it's left to the Supreme Court to over-legislate about internet platforms and speech. So I'm not sure if I did answer your question, but what I think is they're like filling in a vacuum. I don't think it's ideal, but at the same time, I don't think it's ideal not to have any kind of regulation, and plus in an electoral year.
Thank you, Patricia. You answered it very, very well. This is kind of what I feared was the case. I sort of anticipated a question Rodrigo Natrini has put into the Q&A about what he calls smart regulation. And I think the difficulty that I see interpreting from your remarks, Patricia, is that the Supreme Court inevitably gets politicized, doesn't it? It's seen as sort of a captive of the left, or can be portrayed that way. So the natural reaction on the right is, well, get rid of the Supreme Court. And in fact, that I can imagine, it's horrifying to consider that, but that's actually a strong movement here in in Brazil. But thank you very much, Pati. We'll go quickly on this issue of what sort of regulation. Could I turn to you, Jamal, and excuse me if I didn't capture your full nuance, but you talked about the distinction between natural monopolies and just regular old monopolies that need to be that do need to be broken up. And I wasn't quite clear the message that you could you maybe talk about that again? For example, should Elon Musk or Meta, the Meta folks, or anyone controlling these platforms, aren't they sort of like the John D. Rockefellers and Cornelius Vanderbilts of our era? They have enormous amounts of power that really it can be harmful to society. Is there an argument there that I understand? And first of all, maybe I didn't understand you correctly, but you could, I think, get the sense of what I'm going at. Whether there's an argument there that more regulation or even breaking up some of these large media companies, this is in the public interest.
Well, I think anytime you have a tremendous amount of regulatory power bound up with a single entity, and that entity is unaccountable, especially if that entity controls lots of public discourse, it's something that we should be concerned about. The distinction I was drawing, though, and I think this is maybe relevant to this question, is between a monopoly that develops because of innovation or because of network effects. And social media, I think, is a typical monopoly of that sort, where people go wherever the other people are, and that's how the platform grows, and that can accelerate growth, right? And it feeds upon itself. But those kinds of monopolies can get broken up as well, and they can get broken up naturally, right? So I don't know if anyone remembers Friendster or MySpace, and years from now we may not remember Facebook. These things change over time, and they change because of because of innovation by other competitors, because of network effects that go in the other direction, so that once people leave the platform, people don't want to be on it anymore. That's distinct from the reason you're not a monopoly is because you laid all the rail, or you have all the power cables underground, and so it's very difficult to enter. So I was drawing that distinction. I'm not a competition scholar, and I don't want to get too deep into who should be broken up or what. What I will say is that just in terms of government regulation, I think there are all the kinds of worries that Patricia raises, and it's easy, certainly sitting in the United States, where the typical debates are debates about, are the platforms censoring too much, or are they allowing too much harm, right? That tends to be the left-right debate in the US. We don't tend to have a debate about, is the government, torturing its political enemies, or using platforms to go after people, which is the debate in lots of other countries, and really is something to be concerned about. On the other hand, pure self-regulation for familiar reasons, profit motive, et cetera, is also problematic. Two potential, not solutions, but mitigations of that problem. One, institutions like the Oversight Board are designed to be in between those spaces, to be independent of profit incentives, but also independent of partisan incentives. I'm not going to cheerlead for the Oversight Board and say that it has solved all these problems. They're really hard, really complex problems, but that's the aspiration, is to create sort of mediating institutions. The other thing is that governments can be involved in ways that aren't directly regulatory, such as by encouraging, the Digital Services Act. I think the most important part of it is encouraging transparency, encouraging due process, which is really important. But also, governments can be involved in the market themselves. I mean, Ethan Zuckerman at UMass Amherst, talks about digital public infrastructure, creating, having an entry point for some publicly oriented institution to compete within these spaces. Why do we have to go to Twitter or Facebook or YouTube? Why can't we go to a government site? Now, I understand all of the problems that's associated with that, but you can design institutions to have some degree of accountability, some degree of independence from the partisan and political wing of government. So I'll stop there because I know we're short on time.
We're a little bit short on time, but that publicly oriented, that's a fascinating idea. Jamal, a little bit like an NPR in the age of the internet.
Right.
Is that something?
Or BBC or right.
BBC, something like that. Ronaldo, your maybe wrap-up comments. Maybe have one then before we close our session this afternoon. It's a kind of fascinating tour de force, and some people are asking whether the proceedings are being recorded. We'll hope to produce a short written summary to, in the old-fashioned way, produce a written summary of what's been said today for those of you who aren't able to participate in the Q&A. But Ronaldo, please, your final reactions and comments, and a little bit about whether you think the experience in a mediation by the private sector, Jamal mentioned that you participate in the oversight board, something like that, having a role to play in Brazil to prevent really heavy-handed government interference with the social media channels. But anything else you'd like to comment on, Ronaldo?
Absolutely. So quickly, some short comments. First, I completely agree with Jamal. I think the oversight board is an important experiment as well in regards to building a new institution, like of using institutional imagination in order to deal with a new problem. And I think we should definitely look into those experiments. I was happy to see that, for instance, a social network in India called Cool is creating their own oversight board inspired by the efforts that we've done at building the oversight board in regards to Meta. So I like that a lot. I think institutions, they will need to be permanently evolving in order to basically deal with problems that are completely complex and also evolving. Second point is the debates we are having here, they're not going to get easier. They're going to get even more difficult. So one thing about like the role of the private sector versus the public sector is that there's a lot of people excited with this idea of a Web 3.0. So if that goes forward as pretended and designed, what we are going to see sooner rather than later is platforms that are not actually controlled by a company, but are programmed as software in the network itself. So it's interesting to see, like, for instance, Jack Dorsey, the founder of Twitter, he is someone that wanted to advance that idea in regards of Twitter. He thought that Twitter should be a feature of the internet and not really a platform that is run by a company. And you see similar ideas here and there, basically pointing into that direction. So websites like BitClout and others are trying to do something similar. And of course, that poses a lot of problems, right? So if global services like that, they become decentralized, they become embedded in the network itself, they will have a completely different kind of governance, which might poses, of course, opportunities, but also challenges. So in other words, a lot of what we are debating here is a product of our time. And as technology evolves, I don't think complexity is going to reduce. I think it's going to get even more complicated. So we might have to organize conversations like this again and again. Thomas. So thank you so much.
That was going to be my wrap-up question. What should we go on to next? Apologies, I didn't get to all the questions. There's some in the chat in space, and one unanswered, one by Victor Cunha. I think that, Victor, you were asking a question about the Supreme Court essentially assuming the role of the legislature, that the Congress doesn't want to pass legislation, so the Supreme Court steps in and in fact passes regulation. But I think Patricia, in her comments, and to extent Ronaldo already answered that, I hope you'll forgive me for that. I just, maybe could I find just one general question? We'll wrap up a minute or 30 seconds or a minute from each of you. And if it's a fair question or not, you can decide. But why do people, I mean, people like me were so bothered by the proliferation of hate speech and the vilification that occurs? As I started out this afternoon session, why do people believe this stuff? The most incredible stories that circulate get picked up and forwarded on and shared and so forth. my own personal explanation is the lack of local news channels. We've really kind of stopped. We don't really, the large media platforms, you're right, have kind of moved into a space, Jamal, but they've kind of taken the place of local newspapers and local political discussions. So everything becomes very national in its origin. Our information is from a very small number of sources, and the algorithms, of course, reinforce that. But why do people believe that? Is that a fair question to Ron Pup? If it isn't, ignore it and say whatever you'd like, but maybe we'll start with you, Fatih, because we started with you. But why do people believe this stuff? What's going on? Where have we as educators failed?
I think sometimes it's not even that they believe in it. They choose their news sources, right? And nowadays you can live in a parallel news ecosystem where you have sources, be it, junk news sites or social media profiles or accounts that endorse whatever you want to hear or what are your previous beliefs. So when people say, oh, we need more education, of course, yes, we do need more education, but I don't think that's due to lack of education or no, there's people they just choose what news sources they want, and they just, live in that parallel news ecosystem.
Thank you, Patricia. Jamal, is it fair to bounce the same question up to you by way of wrap up?
I'll just make two brief points. One is just consistent with what Patricia said is news has become entertainment. It's, it's infotainment. Yeah. And so I'm not sure that it's really a question of people believing things so much as wanting to see them or being attracted to them in some way. The other point is I just think back to, one of the most famous American sociological works, the Richard Hofstadter's The Paranoid Style in American Politics, which is written in the 1960s, where he talks about how everyone's paranoid and everyone's a conspiracy theorist. And now these people can all find each other really easily online. And so I don't know that it's a new problem in that there are people who weren't there before. It's just that they can find each other more easily now.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jamal. Final word is yours, Ronaldo, and we'll wrap up.
No, I don't have any more to say, but I really think that it feels to me that the form of public sphere that we have right now is one that want to make sure that people have a lot of certainties, right? I would rather have one that would make sure that people have a lot of doubts. So I think the excess of certainties is probably one of the problems that we face in public communication right now. But that's it. Thank you so much, Thomas.
Thank you so much. And no doubt contributes to the horrible polarization we see all over the world, the rise of authoritarianism and so forth. Well, I'm very proud to have, on behalf of all my colleagues at the Global Centers, on behalf of our partners at Samambaya Philanthropias, I'm very proud to have hosted the three of you have had such a lively debate. We're going to keep debating this issue. It's kind of every time we talk about it, there's more issues that surface and we want to get into. But you, Jamal, Patricia, Ronaldo, have been a big help to us all. And we, on behalf of everyone who's listened in and those who will be here listening in on recording, those who are listening in live on YouTube, thank you very, very much. And we look forward to talking to each of you, or maybe all of you together in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Ciao, ciao.